The forest is silent. It's the pre-dawn dark of December 16th, 1944. Here in the Ardennes, along the border of Belgium and Germany, the war feels distant. Snow muffles the world, clinging heavy to the pines. For the American soldiers of the 99th Infantry Division, this is the ghost front, a quiet sector to rest, to integrate new replacements, to get used to the European winter. A young radio operator, huddled near Elsenborn Ridge, blows on his stiff fingers. The only sounds are the crunch of his own boots on ice-crusted snow and the soft murmur of his comrades, breathing from their foxholes. The air is so cold, each breath crystallizes in front of his face. After the brutal fighting in the Hurtgen forest, this quiet feels earned. The consensus up and down the Allied line is the same. Germany is on its last legs. The war will be over by spring. Then the world explodes. At 5:30 a.m., a wave of sound, a physical force, shatters the stillness. Nearly 2,000 German artillery pieces open fire all at once. The ground heaves. Trees splinter and fall like matchsticks. The sky flashes with an unnatural, strobing dawn. Out of the fog and the swirling snow they come. Shapes emerge from the mist. The hulking silhouettes of Tiger and Panther tanks. Their engines a deep, guttural roar. Gray-clad infantry swarm forward. A relentless tide surging out of the forest. This isn't a raid. This is a storm. The American lines, stretched thin and manned by green troops, are hit with a ferocity no one thought the German army had left. These soldiers, boys from Ohio and Texas, were told they were in a safe zone. Now they face the full, desperate fury of the Wehrmacht. This was Hitler's final monumental gamble. Codenamed Watch on the Rhine. The plan was audacious, born of pure desperation. 3 German armies would smash through the weak Ardennes sector, drive a wedge between the British and American forces, cross the Meuse River, and then pivot north to seize the vital port of Antwerp. Cut off from their primary supply base, the Allies would be forced to the negotiating table. Hitler was banking on 2 things: total surprise, and weather so foul it would keep the Allies' greatest weapon, their air power, grounded. For the men on the receiving end, there are no grand strategies, only shock and survival. Our young radio man with the 99th scrambles to get a message out, his hands shaking as shell-shocked men stream past him. Rumors fly like shrapnel of German commandos dressed in American uniforms, speaking perfect English, cutting telephone wires and turning road signs. The most feared German spearhead, Kampfgruppe Peiper, a hardened SS panzer unit, is already knifing deep into their lines. Miles to the west, in the Belgian town of Bastogne, a young nurse wakes to the distant, rhythmic thunder. She thinks it's just another far-off barrage, but the sound is growing, getting closer. She has no idea her small market town sits on a crucial crossroads, directly in the path of the German advance. Further south, a tanker in Patton's 4th Armored Division cleans the breech of his Sherman's cannon. His war is miles away, grinding toward the German heartland. He doesn't know it yet, but in a matter of hours his entire division will be ordered to turn 90 degrees and race north into a frozen hell. And in a billet near Reims, France, a paratrooper from the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles, is woken from a deep sleep. He and his buddies have been resting since their jump into Holland. Now, sergeants are kicking down doors, shouting orders. Get your gear. Now. They're being loaded onto trucks. Destination unknown. All they're told is there's a breakthrough. They're going to a place most of them have never heard of, Bastogne. Back at Allied headquarters, disbelief gives way to controlled panic. Maps are unfurled under dim bulbs. Officers shout into telephones, trying to piece together a coherent picture from frantic, fragmented reports. An 80-mile front has just been ripped open. A disaster nobody saw coming is unfolding by the hour. The Allied line is bending under the immense pressure. Trucks rev their engines in the frozen mud. Reserves are mobilized, and an entire army pivots to face a nightmare erupting from the forest. The question hangs in the cold December air, unanswered. Will the line bend, or will it break? The German tide surged forward, a gray wave flooding the green Ardennes. But at the very edges of this torrent, tiny islands of defiance held firm. Near a forgotten crossroads, a single American platoon, no more than 30 men, clung to a cluster of stone farmhouses. They should have been overrun hours ago. Instead, they repelled assault after assault, their rifles and machine guns spitting fire into the swirling snow. For them, the bigger picture didn't exist. There was only this patch of frozen earth, these houses, and the enemy trying to tear it from their grasp. Along the main roads, the German spearheads created a different kind of chaos. Columns of Belgian civilians, their life's possessions piled onto carts and baby carriages, trudged west, their faces numb with cold and a familiar dread. They mixed with retreating American units, creating bottlenecks where fear was as thick as the mud. At these choked junctions, a lost supply truck, a panicked officer, or a stalled tank could bring everything to a standstill, turning order into a frantic, desperate scramble. Yet, amidst the confusion, a new line was beginning to harden. Along the northern shoulder of the Bulge, on a wind-swept plateau called Elsenborn Ridge, the men of the 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions dug in. Battered and bloodied, they refused to break. Every yard the Germans gained here was paid for in blood, slowing the northern pincer of the attack to a crawl. Further south, around the vital road hub of St. Vith, General Bruce Clarke orchestrated a masterful holding action. His surrounded force fought with a stubbornness that infuriated the German command, buying precious hours that soon stretched into days the Allies desperately needed. But the most terrifying threat came from the south, where the steel beasts of Joachim Peiper's Panzergruppe chewed up the miles. His column of tanks was a mailed fist punching deep into the American rear. Word of their terrifying advance spread like wildfire, carried on the lips of shaken soldiers. Then came the news from a field near Malmedy. A whisper at first, then a horrifying certainty. A massacre. The story of captured Americans gunned down in the snow sent a shockwave of both terror and grim resolve through the Allied lines. This was no longer just a battle. It was a fight against savagery. All eyes turned to a small, unassuming town, Bastogne. As Peiper's tanks threatened to cut the Ardennes in half, the 101st Airborne Division was rushed towards this critical crossroads. They rumbled through the night in open-top trucks, a taxicab army with faces raw from the biting wind, their destination unknown until they arrived. They were just in time. Soon after they deployed into the woods and fields surrounding the town, the last road was cut. The ring snapped shut. Bastogne was surrounded. Inside the besieged town, life descended into a state of surreal emergency. The cellars of homes and cafes became makeshift hospitals, filled with the groans of the wounded. Surgeons worked by candlelight as supplies of morphine and plasma dwindled. Ammunition was carefully rationed at the front lines. Belgian civilians, caught in the siege, shared their dwindling supplies of bread and opened their homes, their quiet courage a steadying presence amidst the chaos. And above it all, a constant, oppressive quiet. The sky was a ceiling of solid gray. Thick fog and freezing sleet grounded the all-powerful Allied air forces, leaving the men on the ground feeling utterly alone. The only sound from the sky was the low, menacing thud of German artillery, getting closer with each passing hour. Far from the front, at the highest levels of command, the map told a story of near disaster. Eisenhower felt the immense pressure, his plans for a final push into Germany shattered. General Bradley, whose armies were being torn apart, felt the strain etched onto his face. But in the midst of this crisis, one voice boomed with impossible confidence. General George S. Patton, meeting with the High Command, made an audacious promise. He would disengage his entire Third Army currently fighting to the south, turn it 90 degrees, and march it through a blizzard to relieve Bastogne. It was a maneuver most considered impossible. Back in the snow-dusted forests around the town, theory meant nothing. In the deepening gloom, an American paratrooper in his foxhole strained his ears, peering into the white void. He could hear the clank and squeal of tank treads, the guttural shouts of German infantry. He checked his rifle one last time, his breath misting in the frigid air. The German armor was nosing forward, ghostly shapes emerging from the fog. The foxholes of Bastogne held their breath, steeling for the impact, as the weather and the war pressed down on them all. Inside the shrinking pocket of Bastogne, the world has narrowed to the metallic taste of fear and the biting cold. Snow isn't a blanket. It's a shroud, muffling the cries from the aid station. A medic, his hands numb, splints a shattered leg with a rifle stock and torn webbing. He doesn't have time to think about the man's name, only the next wound and the one after that. Nearby, a chaplain moves between stretchers laid out in the nave of a half-destroyed church. His words are a low murmur, a quiet counterpoint to the distant crump of artillery. He's not praying for miracles, just for a moment of peace for the boys whose war is ending here, one shallow breath at a time. In his foxhole, a paratrooper from the 101st Airborne does his grim arithmetic. He lays out his last few clips of ammunition for his M1 rifle. 8 rounds per clip. He counts them again, as if the number might magically increase. Each round is a promise he has to keep to the man next to him. Every shadow in the woods could be the beginning of the end. The hunger is a dull ache, but the cold is a constant, relentless enemy seeping into his bones. Morale is a flickering candle in a hurricane, sustained only by shared hardship and the stubborn refusal to break. Then, a flicker of something else. A German delegation under a white flag brings a typewritten ultimatum to the American command post. The demand is simple: surrender honorably or face total annihilation. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe reads the lengthy German text. He looks up at his staff, a mix of disbelief and dark amusement on his face. They want us to surrender? He asks. Someone suggests a formal diplomatic reply. But McAuliffe, capturing the spirit of his besieged men, has a better idea. Nuts! He scoffs. The word hangs in the air, a perfect, concise, and utterly American expression of defiance. The official reply is typed up, to the German commander. Nuts. From the American commander. The 2 American officers tasked with delivering it trek back through the snow to the German lines. The German officer, confused by the slang, asks what it means. In plain English, the American captain explains, it means go to hell. As the story of the one-word reply ripples through the American lines, it's like a shot of adrenaline. It's absurd. It's insane, and it's exactly what they needed to hear. Laughter, raw and hoarse, echoes from foxholes. For a moment, they aren't just surrounded soldiers. They are the men who told an entire German army. Nuts. Their defiance now has a name. Miles to the south, a different kind of battle is being waged. General Patton's Third Army is a vast machine grinding its way north. Headlights on the endless convoys of trucks and half-tracks are hooded with narrow slits, casting feeble yellow beams into the driving snow. They are a lifeline, inching forward through the frozen hell of the Ardennes. Engineers work in the frigid darkness, their breath pluming as they clear rubble and lay temporary bridges over rivers where the original spans lie twisted in the water. The roar of tank engines is constant. Creighton Abrams is at the front of his 4th Armored Division, pushing his men, pushing his machines, his tanks clawing for traction on the icy roads. Patton's staff are fighting a war on maps, a frantic race against time and consumption rates. How much fuel to get the tanks another 10 miles? How many rations for a division that hasn't eaten a hot meal in days? Every calculation is a matter of life and death. In the midst of this logistical chaos, Patton makes an unusual request. He asks his head chaplain James O'Neill to write a prayer for good weather. O'Neill, a practical man, composes a simple, earnest plea. Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech Thee to restrain these immoderate rains, grant us fair weather for battle. It is a quiet admission of desperation, a hope that something, anything, might turn the tide. Meanwhile, from the German perspective, the map looks different. Their panzers, the spearhead of the offensive, are running on fumes. Fuel gauges dip toward zero. The promised supply columns are bogged down miles behind them, stuck on roads clogged with wrecked vehicles and retreating units. Commanders scream into their radios, demanding their men push forward to take Bastogne now, before the steel beast of the Third Army can arrive. They know their window is closing. Back in the besieged town, the night is alive with probing attacks. German infantry, cloaked by snow and darkness, test the American perimeter. Every burst of machine gun fire from the American lines is a calculated expense. Ammunition is now the most precious currency in the world. The defenders of Bastogne hold on, their hope measured not in days, but in the miles of frozen road that still separate them from relief. On that knife's edge, under a sky still thick with clouds, they wait. The 11th day dawned with an impossible blue. After a week of swirling snow and impenetrable fog, the skies over Bastogne cleared as if by a miracle. The silence that followed the blizzard was soon broken, not by artillery, but by a new, deeper sound. A drone that grew into a roar. Every weary, frostbitten face turned upward. There they were C-47 Skytrains, hundreds of them, a skybridge of hope. Brightly colored parachutes blossomed in the frigid air, trailing bundles of life, ammunition, food, and most precious of all, medical supplies. For the first time in days, a genuine cheer erupted from the foxholes. They weren't forgotten. The joy was fleeting. Just as the C-47s turned for home, the familiar shriek of P-47 Thunderbolts tore through the air. They weren't dropping supplies, they were hunting. Diving on the German armor ringing the town, their machine guns ripped into tank columns and supply trucks that had, until now, operated with impunity under the cover of the storm. The hunter had become the hunted. This sudden air support galvanized the defenders, but also enraged the attackers. The Germans, knowing their window of opportunity was closing, threw everything they had left at the perimeter. Panzer IVs and Panthers hammered the village of Champs on the western edge, their shells turning stone farmhouses into dust. To the southeast, near Marvy, the Grenadiers of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division launched another desperate assault, surging forward through chest-deep snowdrifts. But the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne gave as good as they got. Men from the 501st and 327th, some armed with little more than their rifles and a few grenades, counterattacked into the woods. The Ardennes forest, once a silent, snow-covered cathedral, became an inferno. Pines, ignited by tracer rounds and artillery, popped and cracked like a string of firecrackers, the scent of burning evergreen mixing with cordite. The snow turned black and red. Meanwhile, far to the south, the cavalry was coming. General Patton's Third Army was a snarling beast clawing its way north. The 4th Armored Division, the tip of the spear, was paying for every frozen mile in blood. They fought through a gauntlet of small, shattered villages with names that would be forever etched in their memory. Chemount, Warnock, Bougainville. German anti-tank guns waited at every crossroads. A Sherman tank would lurch around a corner, only to be brewed up in a flash of orange flame. Companies were chewed to pieces, reformed with a handful of survivors, and ordered forward again. Medics, their hands numb with cold, dragged wounded men from the smoking hulls of half-tracks, strapping them to the fenders of jeeps for a hellish ride back to the aid station. While the battle for Bastogne's relief raged, the northern shoulder of the German offensive was collapsing. The famed Kampfgruppe Peiper, the armored fist that had smashed so deep into American lines, was out of gas. At the village of La Glaise, Joachim Peiper was forced to give the order his pride could barely stomach: destroy the tanks. His elite S troopers abandoned their mighty King Tigers and Panthers, leaving them as ghostly steel monuments in the snow, and began a desperate trek back east on foot. The great northern pincer was broken. But for the men inside Bastogne, this news was a distant rumor. Their world was the shrinking perimeter, the dwindling ammunition, and the creeping cold. As dusk fell on the 11th day, the 4th Armored Division, battered but not broken, was massing its remaining strength. They were just a few miles away, gathering for the final, brutal push toward the village of Elsenborn, the last obstacle before the siege lines. Inside the pocket, General McAuliffe and his paratroopers watched the flares hiss into the night sky, illuminating a landscape of destruction. They had survived the day. They had received the miracle of air supply. But the ring of steel around them was still intact. Relief was close, so close they could almost hear it. But another night in the frozen hell of Bastogne had to be endured first, and no one knew if the line would hold until dawn. The snow is deep, the cold is a physical enemy, and for the 101st Airborne encircled in Bastogne, ammunition, food, and hope are running dangerously low. But on December 26th, a rumble begins on the road from the south. It isn't German armor. This is Patton's Third Army, specifically the 4th Armored Division, clawing its way north. Imagine the scene near the village of Elsenborn. Lieutenant Charles Bogus leads C Company of the 37th Tank Battalion. His Sherman tank, nicknamed Cobra King, is at the spearhead. Artillery flashes light up the darkened tree line like a hellish strobe. The barrels of their machine guns are glowing red in the frigid air as they pour fire into the German positions blocking the road. For hours, it's a brutal inch-by-inch fight through entrenched resistance. Every hedgerow could hide an anti-tank gun. Every shadow could be an enemy soldier. Then, through the smoke, the exhaust, and the steam rising from the hot metal, a figure appears. He's not in German gray. He's an American paratrooper, waving them forward, his face a mixture of disbelief and sheer relief. The lead tank grinds to a halt. A tanker reaches down and a paratrooper reaches up. A handshake is exchanged. The siege is broken. That single human connection through the fog of war is the moment the tide begins to turn for Bastogne. But let's be clear, this wasn't an instant Hollywood ending. The corridor was just a few hundred yards wide, a fragile lifeline under constant German fire. Relief was palpable, but the danger was still immense. Bastogne wasn't saved in that moment, it was reinforced. The fight for the town was far from over. Yet this link-up was the critical turning point. Across the wider Ardennes front, Hitler's grand offensive was sputtering out. To the north, the stubborn defense of St. Vith had finally ended. But the American defenders there had cost the Germans a full week, completely wrecking their timetable. The infamous S commander, Joachim Peiper, whose armored column had wreaked havoc, was now on the run, forced to abandon his precious tanks and escape on foot with the remnants of his men. And then the weather broke. The fog and low clouds that had grounded Allied air power for a week finally lifted. The skies filled with P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs. Allied pilots, hungry for targets, began to scour every road, every forest path. For the German columns now exposed in the open, it was a slaughter. What had been a powerful armored fist was now a traffic jam of burning wreckage. The cost of this victory was staggering. The Battle of the Bulge would become the single bloodiest battle the United States Army ever fought, with over 80,000 casualties. Belgian villages were destroyed, civilians were caught in the crossfire, and the brutal winter claimed as many lives as the bullets. But what the battle proved was monumental. This was Hitler's last great gamble in the West, and it failed. He threw his last strategic reserves, his best remaining troops and panzers, into this one desperate offensive, and they were shattered against the iron will of the Allied soldier. The American army, caught by surprise and initially thrown back, refused to break. From the paratroopers in the foxholes around Bastogne to the engineers blowing bridges on the Elsenborn Ridge, to the infantrymen holding nameless clearings in the snow-covered woods, they held the line. The courage of individual soldiers in the freezing mud and snow was what ultimately defeated a dictator's grand ambition. It was their resilience that turned the tide of the war in the West for the final time. This battle is filled with incredible stories of human bravery and endurance. If you want to hear more of these untold stories from World War II, focused on the people who lived them, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching.